Hey there. Great Donkeys of the Bible, Part 4. I think that's the number we're at anyway. And for this one, I'm picking up in Judges chapter 15. This is one of the stories about Samson. Samson has had some issues, some encounters with the Philistines that have left the Philistines quite angry at him and caused trouble. At least the people who live around him, the other Israelites around him, felt like he had caused trouble for them. The situation was the Philistines were their oppressors. They were ruling over some parts of Israel. And so these people in this particular part, being ruled by the Philistines, were not great fans of Samson, who was, they felt provoking them. So in this story in chapter 15, they come to him, explain to him the situation. He gives them well, if that's the way you feel, sure, tie me up and hand me over to him. And so they tie him up and they his people hand him over to their oppressors. And this is where we are at this point in chapter 15, verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned up with fire, and his bonds dropped from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. So, first of all, I think people misimagine Samson. If you imagine Samson as some Herculean muscle man, some great, big, powerful fellow, then I believe you're completely missing the point of the story. That Samson, without the Lord's strength, was insignificant. He didn't have a powerful strength of his own. He was only effective when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. You read through the stories, and that's the emphasis over and over again. The Spirit of the Lord is what gave him strength. Otherwise, he had no strength. So I think it would be more apt to imagine him as a very normal guy, maybe even an insignificant looking fellow. The Lord chose him for a purpose, and that was to emphasize how powerful he was and how he could use anyone, even someone, and as you read this story, the different stories, even someone as goofy as Samson. So Samson, this seemingly insignificant person, is tied up. He is being handed over by his people to the Philistines. When the Philistines see him tied up, they start to shout because they're angry at him. They're grateful to have him tied up, and they're ready to abuse him. And he breaks the ropes, and then it says he reaches down and grabs a fresh jawbone. And so I suppose the writer includes this to help us to understand that the jawbone's not an old jawbone. That would have been interesting in and of itself, but old bones that have been laid out in the sun are dry and brittle. But this was a fresh jawbone, and the word used in the original seems to imply even moist, which is a word we don't use to describe a lot of things, but not bones anyway. But in this case, it's describing that, and it gives people the impression that this jawbone was probably connected to a still rotting the body of a donkey. So there's a donkey. He pulls off its jawbone and then goes to work beating up all these Philistines. This is you know, this is a miracle of some sort, and it's amazing. And I believe the point is that God uses this man who is could be thought of as insignificant, and then he uses the tool in this man's hand as even more insignificant. The jawbone of a donkey that's not a weapon of choice, and yet he used it to bring about this great victory that you know he's going to sing about, and the people will continue to sing about for years and years. They'll sing about how he heaped up the bodies of his enemies with this jawbone, and so it it feels like to me to be the illustration of what we read in First Corinthians. In First Corinthians, maybe chapter 2. You know, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And they're emphasizing the foolishness and the weakness of the gospel. This message that we preach. This is the tool, the jawbone, in the hands of what people consider an insignificant characters, and so God is trying to say, both spelling it out in words and also demonstrating it in the life of Samson, that he can use anyone, and he is wanting to use the foolishness of the gospel, the simplicity of the gospel, to make a public display of his enemies, to make them look as fools. And please understand that we're talking about we're not talking about human beings. We're talking about principalities. We're talking about the devil, who is and those with him who have arrayed themselves against the Lord. So God is using that to transform the world. He's using the gospel in the hands of Christians to transform the world, as simple as it is, as insignificant as we are. Is using the gospel as a jawbone in the hands of his people. So anyway, donkeys, part 4. Beep, bop, boop. See you.